Welcome to ViteConf 2023, and thanks for checking out this presentation. I hope you will walk away having learned something about Vite, Marko, and all the considerations that go into the tooling we use for modern web applications. Firstly, hello, my name is Piercey, and I started building and contributing to open source projects around 2012 when I fell in love with the potential for the web as a platform. Professionally, I've worked at various agencies, building experiences ranging from as simple as a marketing splash page to really quite complex and large web applications. Important to this presentation, though, in 2018, I joined the Marko dev team at eBay, where I work on the open source front-end framework that powers the majority of the eBay web experience. More on that later. You can find me on GitHub at github.com/myname, and I'm also Dylan_Piercey on Twitter. Follow me over there to learn the occasional objective truth I share exclusively on that platform. This presentation is going to be fairly high level. We've only got about 20 minutes. First, we'll go over a question many of you likely have. What is Marko, and why should I care? I'm sure it's a framework many of you haven't heard about, but something I can confidently say is it makes building many types of applications both a joy for you, the developer, and your users. Next, we'll be looking at Vite. This is ViteConf after all. I'll be highlighting many of the strengths that make Vite a great pairing for any front-end framework, and especially Marko. Finally, we'll dig into the finer details of our new meta framework, Marko Run. It's built on top of Vite and Marko. We'll close out with a demo showcasing its simplicity, scalability, and flexibility. So who or what is Marko? Well, one aspect of Marko is that it's not just a framework, but a language. Marko, as we like to describe it, is HTML reimagined. Marko is a superset of HTML that makes describing modern UIs a breeze. The language is designed to be composable, reusable, and familiar. It is as if HTML and JavaScript were developed in harmony. Marko's roots come from a need for optimization, and so one of its key benefits lay there also. Marko is a compiler that takes the Marko language and outputs distinct, optimized JavaScript for both servers and browsers. Marko has been an islands architecture framework long before the term was even coined. If you're unfamiliar, in essence, the islands architecture is about trying to send JavaScript required just for the interactive parts of the page, contrasted with the current status quo of sending an entire application's worth of JavaScript to the browser. With Marko, this is seamless. By default, components are exclusively rendered on the server. Then, the very APIs that you use to add client-side rendering also mark the component as an island. This means you don't have to opt in for a client component. There's no use client pragma here. The API naturally does that for you. So write your client-side logic, and Marko figures out the rest. Finally, another big optimization set in place from the beginning with Marko is progressive rendering. Through a simple HTML tag-based declarative API, you are able to orchestrate how the HTML is chunked and sent to the browser. Marko will ensure that as much HTML is sent over the wire as eagerly as possible, so that the end user is able to see parts of the page earlier. This is great for perceived performance. However, it also means that critical assets such as CSS and scripts and other important assets like images and fonts are able to be seen by the browser earlier. This moves the critical network waterfall earlier and can dramatically improve load times. So I've alluded to some of the things Marko handles for you. Marko is designed as a multi-page app framework with as much of the logic as possible moved exclusively to the server. In Marko, server-side rendering and the natural multi-page document model which browsers have had since 1994 feels first class. Beyond that, though, Marko handles the server-client handoff for you. It finds your islands of interactivity, it serializes any relevant component input, and attempts to execute minimal JavaScript to bootstrap client-side interactivity. In many ways, Marko is also like a bundler. It scans your Marko templates in order to determine the optimal subset of your code and assets to send to the browser. But don't worry, I know this is ViteConf. We still have room for bundlers like Vite. Besides, Marko only mostly cares about the Marko language and not the JavaScript part. So let's take a look at Vite and what features compelled us and many other front-end framework authors to give it such a strong recommendation. At the top of the list for us is something that should probably surprise no one. Vite has first-class SSR support. Vite is a bundler for not only your client-side code, but also your server-side code. This is critical for offering a consistent developer experience across a modern front-end stack. Vite also operates in an unbundled fashion. This optimization allows Vite to do less work and deliver a tighter feedback loop in development. To the browser, Vite serves native ECMAScript modules, and on the server, it similarly only processes and executes on an as-imported basis. Another huge feature of Vite is hot module reloading. If unfamiliar, hot module reloading is essentially swapping out an individual module when making code changes, rather than reloading the entire app. This has huge benefits, like preserving application state. Vite's hot module reloading is client-server aware. When changing a module, Vite can intelligently hot module reload the code in the browser and the server. Critically, though, if code is only hot reloaded on the server, it can smooth things over by doing a page refresh in the browser. This means even for code that is exclusive to the server, you get a tight feedback loop without having to either manually refresh the page or wait for a sometimes lengthy server restart. So we think Marko and Vite make a great pair. If you care about optimization, server-side rendering, and a great DX, it's worth checking out. However, this presentation is mostly about the new meta framework we've built on top of both Marko and Vite, which we call Marko Run. Before we get there, let's consider what some of the primary meta frameworks wrapping other front-end libraries bring to the table. Picking a framework and a bundler is a great starting point. This is especially true for Marko, given its holistic look at the server-client story. In fact, features touted by other front-end frameworks are included by Marko itself in order to deliver the optimizations and features mentioned earlier. So let's take a look at some highlighted features in the marketing material for some other meta frameworks. Most of these meta frameworks should sound familiar. We've got Next.js for React, SvelteKit for Svelte, Nuxt for Vue, and SolidStart for Solid. This is by no means an exhaustive list of frameworks or features, but even with my 2 seconds of scraping buzzwords from their documentation, I believe I have a good representation of common meta framework features. Many list SSR, rendering, or streaming, which is one of the hallmarks of Marko, so of course it's built in. Likewise, due to Marko's server-first mentality and async rendering primitives, data fetching and loading come naturally. Pretty much every meta framework also lists routing as a primary feature. This is surely an important thing to consider when building for the web. In fact, it is a must for SPA framework, which must re-implement navigation in the browser. However, with Marko being a multi-page app framework, historically we've leaned on the robust routing solutions provided on the server, tools such as Express, Fastify, and others. This can work great for large-scale apps, but can also lead to unnecessary boilerplate and inconsistency in the Marko ecosystem. With that in mind, a consistent and fast routing solution certainly is something where a meta framework can help Marko developers. Likewise, a common benefit listed in these meta frameworks is reducing configuration, boilerplate, and simplifying the getting started process. In general, Marko is probably one of, if not the most boilerplate-free frameworks, so we're already doing pretty well there. However, when it comes to bundler integrations and config, in some cases it can be a challenge. In fact, your typical Marko config when working with a Webpack application can easily be hundreds of lines of code. With Vite, though, the configuration is as simple as enabling a single plugin. Still, we'd much prefer zero config, which is something a meta framework can help us out with. Another commonly shared meta framework feature is providing flexible deployment options, again with minimal config. So many of these features caused us to take Marko a step further, pun intended, with our new meta framework, Marko Run. I mentioned what the goals of many of these other meta frameworks are, but what about our goals? For us, a big consideration is ensuring that Marko Run is able to give users full control. As I mentioned earlier, Marko was primarily built to satisfy eBay's performance and developer experience needs. As such, it needs to be able to fit into the sometimes complex eBay ecosystem. It's critical that we give developers all the control they need to embed Marko in many environments, and also give them the ability to fine-tune their applications to achieve performance goals. However, Marko is also an open source project and part of the OpenJS Foundation. We want to see it thrive there as well. With that in mind, we need to ensure that this meta framework can support all flavors of app types and scales, striking the balance between simplicity and flexibility. A fast feedback loop during development is also critical. A great developer experience means nothing if you can't deliver a good user experience. But in the same breath, a great user experience that never ships is even worse. Thankfully, Vite helps us a lot here with its unbundled and hot module reloaded dev mode. Finally, I mentioned that we wanted Marko Run to require zero config. That sounds nice, but often in practice, this can be a lie. Much like the point of a zero.js framework isn't actually about sending zero.js, but instead sending as little JS as possible, we believe config should work the same way. Marko Run not only gives good defaults, infers config where possible, and removes pointless config, it also makes it possible to add config in a way that doesn't quickly become a mess at scale. More on that later. Starting with the Marko Run CLI is as simple as running npx @marko/run. You don't even need to install the module or go through the setup process I just mentioned, although we would recommend doing so. The default command is the dev command. This starts up an unbundled and hot module reloaded development server, thanks to Vite. The build command outputs a production-ready server and browser assets, ready for your deployment target. Finally, the preview command does a production build and starts up a preview server, according to your deployment target. This allows you to quickly test out the final product of your application. When you take a look at the starter project, one cool thing you'll see is there isn't so much as a Vite config in sight, thanks to the great defaults. To extend Marko Run's config, you can add a Vite config.js to fine-tune things further. However, thanks to the adapters I mentioned a few times, even this is often unnecessary. Adapters are discovered simply by having them installed and don't require any config. So what is an adapter? Well, An adapter is essentially a plugin for Marko Run that can change a lot about your application. It can specify alternative defaults in config. It can hook into the dev and build output to optimize things for different environments and targets. Finally, it can implement an entirely different preview environment for your app and as close to a production experience as possible. Some example adapters are the default Node.js adapter, which creates a standalone node server. There's also the static adapter, which will output your Marko Run application to a static HTML site. And this is without you having to change any of your application code, simply install a module. We also have adapters for some serverless solutions like Netlify and soon Cloudflare. And what's great is you can easily make your own adapters for your organization. In fact, at eBay, we've been able to hide otherwise hairy internal configuration and annoying development and preview environment setup behind the eBay Marko Run adapter. This has allowed us to take our relatively complex applications and provide the zero config experience. Besides hiding configuration behind adapters, we are also able to infer configuration based on the project structure and existing files. File system-based routing is another aspect that follows this goal. The routing to your pages and handlers, as well as layouts, route middleware, and even endpoint-specific metadata are all represented simply by their file system path. Taking inspiration from SvelteKit, all of these router-related files are clearly denoted so as not to conflict with other files in your project. This makes co-locating related files, including styles, tests, documentation, storybook stories, and of course other components, easy and safe. And all of this is statically analyzable, which provides many benefits. One of them being that we're able to produce optimal route matching code. In fact, Marko Run compiles your file system routes into an optimal trie-based router. It's actually just a series of nested if statements matching the individual portions of your route structure. It's pretty much as fast a routing matching system as you can get. We also take this static route structure and automatically output TypeScript route definitions, providing you with type-safe route checking for things like path parameters. Marko Run's file-based routing follows a few simple rules that allow us to match any sort of URL. First, the router only picks up on files if they're specially denoted. Inspired by SvelteKit, we opted to use a plus prefix for this. We'll talk more about the other special files soon, but for now, an important thing to remember is that the path structure up to the plus page.marko in this case is what determines which URL to match before serving that particular page. We also provide dynamic segments for URLs, which may be read as params in your application. These are denoted by a $sign for a single route or a double $sign for a catch-all at the end of the route. For simple apps, this is likely all you need to know, but Marko Run provides additional syntax for more complicated paths. This includes pathless segments, alternative paths, and methods for merging multiple path segments into a single file name. Okay, that was a lot of nitty-gritty syntax, which may or may not have left your mind already. So let's take a more visual look. Here, we've got a basic editor Chrome and file structure on the left, and there's also a pretend browser Chrome on the right. You can see the routes folder. We've got two nested folders in there. There's a users folder and a $ID folder. The users folder will ensure we match the user segment before continuing to match in the URL. Then we get the ID folder, which will match a dynamic segment and make it available as an ID property in the params. So that means, given our URL here, the plus page.marko at this folder location will be matched and rendered to the browser. Another special routed file type are layout files. These allow you to wrap your routed page files in additional template code. These can also be nested, allowing you to apply them to only part of your app. Starting with the root layout file, you can see it will receive a render body on its input. For those more familiar with React or other frameworks, this is essentially props.children if you squint. It can then render the body content wherever it likes. In this example, it's wrapping the body content with some HTML boilerplate, as well as an app-wide header and footer. Nothing too crazy. But again, these layouts can be nested. Within the users folder, we see another layout. This one will automatically wrap all pages and layouts from within the users folder. In this case, it's adding a user-specific nav. Again, we receive the next part of the body content as input.renderBody, which we can inject anywhere we see fit. Finally, we get to the page, which will be rendered and provided to the two previously mentioned layouts. Marko Run also provides a routed file called a handler. This can be JavaScript, TypeScript, or really any type of file that compiles to JavaScript. It is able to export functions to handle HTTP verbs such as get and put. These functions receive a context object containing the current incoming request information and should return a response object. This allows you to create API endpoints in your Marko Run application. The get handlers also receive a next method, which will return a promise containing any adjacent page's rendered response. This allows you to easily get in front of rendering a specific page. You can use this to provide data to the page and/or augment the response in some way. In this particular example, we're checking the HTTP accept header and responding with page content when the user agent expects HTML, and otherwise we're responding with a JSON response. Another type of routed file are middlewares. These are like layouts, but for your handlers. They run before any handler or page nested within the same folder, and allow for your logic to run both before and after the handler or page has responded. This is useful for cross-cutting concerns, such as logging, authentication, and more. Flat routes are another important feature of Marko Run's file system-based routing. This feature makes it possible to represent arbitrarily complex route patterns without having to create a bazillion folders. Let's look at the example on screen. It's pretty simple. At the core of it, there's an items page, a products page, and each have a dynamic ID segment. However, either endpoint can also optionally be prefixed with a locale of EN or FR. Technically, anything is possible to represent without flat routes, and this example is no different. As you can see, though, it gets pretty cumbersome. Not only are we creating a bunch of folders to represent each possible permutation, we also have to figure out how we're going to share the logic between them. Possibly this could be done by re-exporting the component all from a canonical source, but it's not great. One way flat routes help simplify this is by allowing alternate segments without requiring alternate folders. You can see here now that we've got a single folder which will match either items or products by just adding a comma between the two possibilities. Having a trailing comma at the end of the segment also marks it as optional. With the folder named en, fr, we can see just that. It will match en or fr or nothing, before going to the next nested folder and continuing the match. Beyond having a shorthand for alternates, there's also one for collapsing nesting. Using a period in a routed file or folder within Marko Run will act the same as a nested folder. Even something as complex as this can be represented as a single file or folder. We can combine the period nesting syntax, comma alternate syntax, and use parentheses to group path segment expressions, leaving us with what's on the screen to the right. I'm not saying you should ever have a routed file like this, but in practice, these things end up being a lot simpler. In a pinch, they can be extremely handy for code organization and layout and middleware application. It's also useful for the occasional one-off complex route that you might have in your application. All right, that was a lot about routing syntax. Like I mentioned earlier, though, an important job of a meta framework is to provide a robust routing solution, and I think Marko Run delivers one of the best. We'll end off with one of my favorite features of Marko Run, which is that you can easily bring in your own server. To do this, first pass in a script as the entry point for the various Marko Run CLI commands. This script will be processed by Vite, meaning you can use TypeScript and other features of Vite. While running in dev mode, it will also automatically reload the server whenever any code changes that isn't a part of Marko Run's routes. Then you can simply load the relevant API into your application, which can be different based on the adapter you have installed. In this example, we're using the Node adapter. You can see it allows you to import all of the Marko Run routing code as a simple, Express-compatible middleware. But we can go a bit lower level and see what the Node adapter's middleware is built on top of. The core API for all of your Marko Run routes can be loaded by importing @marko/run/router. Most importantly, this module is what provides programmatic access to the trie-based router that will ultimately serve your Marko Run pages and handlers. One cool thing here is that the API is actually modeled after the fetch API. Calling run.fetch with a request instance will return a promise with a response instance. This is a very simple API that happens to integrate very easily with some runtimes such as service workers, Cloudflare workers, and even Bun. Okay, we've gone over a lot, and I've really only scratched the surface of Marko Run. So let's go kick the tires in VS Code. Here we're looking at a fresh Marko Run project initialized through the Marko Create CLI, with some slight tweaks for ViteConf. You can see there's not a lot going on here, and that's a good thing. At the root, we see a bog standard TS config, as well as the package JSON. The package JSON is also pretty simple. It just lists Marko and Marko Run as dependencies and has some scripts which defer to the Marko Run CLI commands. So let's run the starter and see what it looks like. We'll go ahead and click on this link to see a nice looking grayscale Marko logo. This example has some client-side interactivity as well that enables this cool effect where moving the mouse position reveals the actual colors of the Marko logo. Now back over on the VS Code side, let's jump into the routes folder. We can see our routed files like this layout and page over here. We're going to first open up the layout. Again, in Marko, the starting point is HTML. We've got our basic HTML structure here. You can also get nice things like the ability to reference relative asset paths like this favicon, and still have them go through Vite's optimization pipeline. Heading over to the page, again, we've got some simple markup and a reference to this mouse mask component, which is actually what provides our cool color effect. Now, Marko tries to keep code on the server. The layout we just saw and the page we're looking at now are actually both server components. They don't send any JavaScript to the browser since they don't use any client rendering features. But let's go ahead and follow the suggestion of editing the page.marko and see what happens. You can see the change is reflected pretty much immediately, but what you might have missed is that this was actually a full page reload, since this is a server component. Critically though, it did not restart the server. Instead, the server was able to do a hot module reload while the browser did a page refresh. Okay, so we're going to check out a client component. We'll command click on this mouse mask component over here to jump to it. There's some syntax here and shorthands I'm not going to cover right now, but the important thing is that this component registers a class seen on line 15. This class adds some client-side behavior to synchronize the mouse position with CSS custom properties on line 9. Now I'm going to make a small change to this component to disable the styling that makes the Marko logo grayscale. You can see this time, Vite is logging that we've done an HMR update, and in fact, no page reload has occurred and the client state is persisted. This is kind of a short demo, but I want to show one last thing. First, we run the Marko build command. You can see in the dist folder, we have our client-side assets and a script which contains our server-side code. If we run that file with Node, we can see that we have the same app, but running in production mode. Of course, a simpler way to do this would just be to use the Marko preview command like so. This again creates a production build and then runs it for us. All right, finally, let's try and install one of our adapters. I mentioned earlier that the static adapter can take your Marko Run site and output a static HTML site, which you could then easily deploy to hosts such as GitHub Pages. So I just run the npm install command with Marko Run static adapter, and then we'll rerun the build command. This time in the dist, we can see a static HTML file without any changes to our app. I can then serve this new build project using the same preview command or any off-the-shelf static file server. There's one on npm called serve, so if I just npx serve and point to the dist folder, you can again see the same experience, but this time served from static HTML. That concludes the demo and my presentation. Thanks for taking the time to check it out, and thank you to ViteConf for having me. I hope this presentation leaves you with some insight into the kinds of considerations that go into frameworks and meta-framers, and why Vite has helped so many of them tie the experience all together. I hope you'll take the time to give Marko Run a try. I think you'll find it makes you a little faster. Thank you.